Welcome back, everybody. We have Lewis here again with us to go over some videos by Rabbi Tovia Singer. I think we decided to do this after we had some conversations on Twitter, um, talking about him, and we just kind of wanted to run over some of his content. He has some very interesting stuff. I think he has a YouTube channel too. I think it's under Rabbi Tovia Singer, I think is the channel name. Um, and so if you want to go and check these out, they should be on there. I think these are some of his more popular videos. And then, yeah, I think that's it.
Cool. It sounds good, man. Thanks for having me back on.
No problem. All right, let's get started with this first one.
All right.
Rabbi, we're going to roll with the last
question for the day. And I think this is just a great question. It's more of a good thought. Just to think about this is pretty interesting. I mean, with Christianity, wouldn't it have been so easy for the Jew or for to produce the bones of Jesus? Why do we have to argue the point? Why can't we just come up with physical proof that he was not the Messiah, that he didn't get resurrected from the dead? They've got this right here, and there you go. There's the answer. But now you've got the Shroud of Turin, where they're saying this was definitely the body of Jesus when no one knows. It's just, a lot of speculation. So how are we supposed to view that concept altogether? Is there enough in the text to just... Yes, go ahead.
I apologize because I didn't understand the question.
That's okay. I get the talking too fast.
What exactly?
Hey, could you pause it for a second, real quick second? I'm getting a ton of echo on my end. I don't know if are you hearing that echo? You may need to mute yours while it's the video's playing or something. I'm not sure, but I'm getting a lot of echo. But
yeah.
Try as you're playing the video, mute your own mic on your headset or whatever. I don't know if you can do that. But...
Yeah, I should be able to, but it's weird. Let's see. I always have these difficulties. I don't know why.
It's technology, man. Every time something always goes wrong.
This computer really does not like running stuff the way it's supposed to.
Let me. Because I need to.
Okay.
Just from that real quick second, it sounded right. I didn't hear any echo.
All right. Let's try that.
Okay.
Be able to respond.
Let me read it straight from the email. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's see. I'm going to read the full. There's a little paragraph here because I may be missing something myself. I was reading your piece on the resurrection of Jesus. I also stumble when it comes to this topic. It was such an important event, his crucifixion. Forget the New Testament narratives. All anyone had to do to crush Christianity was to produce the body. I admire your ability to articulate ideas, not my strength. General compassion is my strength anyway. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that the tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers to shut up early Christians. Just show the body. That's the end of the statement. Does that help you at all?
The question is specifically, were not guards posted at the tomb, thereby making it impossible for someone to sneak the body out? Now, what the basis of this question is an M source. M source means it's only found in Matthew, and it's Matthew chapter 27, verse 62. It's part of Matthew's passion narrative. And what we find but it's really silly. Now, all right, so the point is in Matthew 27, I'll just explain it, is Jesus is, we are told in Matthew, is crucified on Friday, as in all the Gospels. Jesus crucified on Friday. Now, what happens is the text says that the following day, the Jews, the priests, Pharisees, came and said that, the day after means Saturday, and said to the Romans, you know what? They're going to go and say that someone stole the body from the tomb. We have to then put soldiers in front of the tomb. So this way, it can't be said that someone stole the body. This is the next day. This is not the day. This is not Friday. This is Saturday. This is according to Matthew. Please read it for yourself. Matthew 27, verse 60, 61, 62, 63. This is how the whole thing ends. And in fact, Pontius Pilate, the governor of the empire of this region, who ruled until 37, we are told acquiesced to such a request. In verse 65, in the passage, chapter ends with verse 66. The Pilate says, go ahead. Now, the reason why this is, I don't believe any of this happened, but this is a very, very bad argument, because if game, what if? If this is the case, when will the guards put at the tomb? Now, I do not subscribe to this. I don't think none of this happened. But I'm going to just play along with the story. If Pilate, placed Roman soldiers at the tomb on Saturday, what would prevent someone from stealing the body Friday night? It actually doesn't solve the problem. That's number one. So it's actually, this is so M. You're going, M? This is so Matthew, meaning we don't know who wrote the book of Matthew. We don't know where it was written, and I don't care what your pastor tells you, we don't know. But I will tell you this, Matthew is the shlemazel of the New Testament. What is a shlemazel? It's a Yiddish word. There's a shlemazel and a shlemiel. The shlemazel is the guy who drops the banana peel, and the shlemiel is the one who trips over it. Matthew, repeatedly makes these kinds of errors, really serious errors, that make his story so, it's almost as if like God put in whoever wrote this book's head so many errors that it's hard to imagine that no one ever corrected this. Like, how does it, they could have just stolen the right. Now, again, don't start writing me in letters going, I don't believe any of this, but the story doesn't help anything, okay? Number two is, the question asks, if Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead, why didn't they just produce the empty body? Now it would have settled and Christianity would come to a close. So there's a presupposition. It's a fallacy. You are presupposing that there was a body available to produce. That means you're presupposing the passion narrative that we find in all the Gospels. You're presupposing that this is what happened, that Jesus crucified on Friday. Forget about all the disagreements. I want to talk about what they share in common. That Jesus crucified on Friday, and then whatever he says on the cross, there's 7 endings, he's then placed inside the tomb, and then women, whoever they are, discover him on Sunday morning. Okay, that's the key point. And then they go and tell others that Jesus rose. In the Synod, in most of the Gospels, they meet Jesus in the Galilee. In Luke, they find him in Jerusalem. Great. You're presupposing that something remotely like that occurred. Well, I don't believe that for 1 second. That means that, and incidentally, would the Christian Bible really record, let's say they did produce a body, and by the way, I don't believe this either. Would the Christian Bible write this? Would they report this? Of course they wouldn't. The whole function of the Testament is to convince you to believe in Christianity. How do you know? Because I said it says in John 20, all this was written so that you might believe. So of course, if theoretically, again, I don't believe this happened, and I'll tell you, I'm not saying what likely happened, but something that's much more plausible. But let's just play the game, what if? If someone had the body with the writers of a book written 50 years after the crucifixion, like Matthew, written, let's say 90, 85, 40, 50 years later, would Matthew go, and by the way, they produced the body, but no, of course they wouldn't write it because he's a Christian.
All right.
They don't want to write anything.
Hey, I don't know if you want to pause it there, but there's a lot there. Maybe we should try and digest some of it. So basically, the question was, why not produce a body? And then he went into kind of that whole question of like the guards, you know what I mean? And like, they put guards there on Saturday, which meant there was a gap, in theory. And honestly, even I would say he didn't even go further there, and that the Bible is pretty explicit that when the guards saw him raised, that the Jewish people then paid the guards to say that they had fallen asleep. So like even there, like there's a couple, in my opinion, even he didn't even dismiss the guards enough. Like I agree, the guards are not an effective answer to the question, but if you notice, the question itself didn't actually say anything about the guards, and I don't think the good answer to that question has anything to do with the guards. So, you know, my opinion, why I think it is a good question of like, why not the body? Like, why didn't you produce the body? Is this like, here's what I would say is I would say this is a fairly small community. Like that we think of Jerusalem as this big city. It had about 10,000 people at the time, which would be like a moderate sized village in the United States, right? It's not a giant city, pretty tight knit community. Jesus was very famous individual, you know, infamous, famous, whatever. He's very, very well known. The idea that a few days later, and you know, the Bible records the apostles, you know, within 40 days there in the middle of Jerusalem claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. The idea they could do that and not have people say, whoa, wait a second, I think is a big question. But the other thing that I thought I find majorly problematic with this whole attitude of like, hey, they stole the body, or they, even if there was evidence of the body, they wouldn't put it in the New Testament. I find that to be, problematic to say the least. I don't know how familiar you are with 1 Corinthians chapter 15, but 1 Corinthians 15, or the book of 1 Corinthians, is maybe the earliest Christian document we have. So it goes all the way back to, they think it was written somewhere in the early 50s AD. And this is not just Christians that think this. This is pretty much all scholars think 1 Corinthians was written, roughly 20 years after the event. And in that 1 Corinthians, which, by the way, was written by the Apostle Paul, who claimed to have seen the risen Jesus himself, he says the following. He says in 1 Corinthians 15:12, he says, but if Christ is preached that some have been raised from the dead, but how can you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then even Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. He then goes on in verse 29, he says, if there's no resurrection, what will they do to those that are baptized for the dead if the dead have not been raised? I die. Then he goes on, he says in verse 30, he says, and as for us, why do we endanger ourselves every hour? I die every day. I mean that, brothers, just as surely as I glory in our Lord Jesus Christ. If I fought wild beasts and Ephesus for merely human reasons, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. And he goes on, further on in that 1 Corinthians 15, and just goes on and on about like how incredibly important it is that Jesus was raised from the dead, and how like his, the Apostle Paul's whole faith, he's basically saying, I gave up everything for this. And if he didn't really rise from the dead, why am I doing what I'm doing? Like that's the Apostle Paul's like whole life. As he's getting stoned, he's getting chased out of places. He's saying, I'm being beat up, I die every day, and I'm doing it because Jesus was raised from the dead. Rabbi Tovia's statement of like, hey, they would just cover it up. Like, I think they'd be the last people on the planet to cover it up. There was a lot of messianic movements in the first century, and they kind of had a standard. They often died on the cross when they claimed to be a Messiah, and they had a standard way of dealing with that, which was either the messianic movement fades, or they would appoint the brother or a close relative of the messianic leader to carry on his mantle. And in the case of Jesus, like he did have a brother, his James, who, by the way, the Apostle Paul knew and talks about in Galatians and Ephesians, like it would be strange for them just to all of a sudden invent this idea that he rose from the dead. Furthermore, to like claim the Apostle Paul saying like this is where our whole faith lies. Like we're pathetic. If this didn't happen, it's pathetic. So I don't know what your thought is there, but like that's my initial response is like I don't think it's true that if they found the body, they wouldn't say it. Like, of course they would. Like there was a lot of that often in most messianic cases, they did find the body, right?
Right. For me, I think there's one or two major issues here I would have. I know I agree with him on some stuff, but here I do have an issue. Number one, I don't think anyone's claiming it has to be written in the New Testament. I do think there are mentions in the Gospels where they record that they said the disciples stole the body. So there are examples in the Gospels where the disciples did get blamed for the empty tomb. Also, why didn't they produce the body? And his excuse was, well, if they did, you're not going to write that in New Testament. Well, that's fair, but you're going to write it somewhere else. You know, in our earlier Jewish polemics that could be considered more anti-Christian, we don't have anything like that. We don't have anybody around that time at all, writing around the time of Paul or the Gospels, or even into the 2nd century that ever claim anything about, them providing a body.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to see if they did, but there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no writings.
Yeah, there's not only no writings, but the interesting thing is the growth of the Christian movement really started in this region, right? So like even if we lost the writings or whatever, it seems like the movement wouldn't go very far if it's all built on this guy rising from the dead and they had like irrefutable proof that he didn't rise from the dead, right?
Well, and you got 1 Corinthians, which most scholars, I mean, you have a few here and there, but as Dale Allison points out in his book, the tomb, the buried portion of that creed there is very early. It was recorded, and that creed probably came before Paul, and then Paul kind of added his own story onto there.
Sure.
But the buried portion of that, which would in the Gospels be the tomb, is early. And then they record he rose from the dead. Now, there's nothing about an empty tomb in there, but then again, you're in a short creed. You're not going to add a bunch of little details. But the buried and rising portion in that creed is dated earlier than Paul, so earlier than early 50s. Meaning that obviously there was a movement before Paul that believed Jesus rose from the dead. And so it'd be kind of hard to imagine this tight-knit group of 10,000 providing a body and then it just exploding and growing. And then, we got the body. And like these 10,000 people in a community like that, if someone provided the body, everyone's going to know.
Right.
And everyone's going to be like, you're full of BS, basically.
Yeah.
But as far as I'm aware, there's no sources saying that.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, I mean, for it to grow in that area and really take its root in that area would be really strange if there was a body laying around. And then the other thing, just to tie on what you were saying there, is one of the things, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about N.T. Wright here, but one of the things Wright talks about in his appendix to the book, There Is a God, by Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew is I don't know how familiar you are with him, but he's a big atheist in the 20th century. He converted to theism towards the end of his life. And he asked N.T. Wright to write one of the appendixes in the back of his book about the argument for Christianity, and N.T. Wright real briefly gave an argument for the resurrection in there. And one of the things he talked about, just pushing the resurrection story back, like you were kind of doing there with the creed, was what N.T. Wright said is that throughout the entire Christian world, from every record we have going all throughout the world, there's this story of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and not only death and resurrection of Jesus, but also as we see in 1 Corinthians 15, the parallel to our own resurrection, because the Christian hope obviously is that we all then are in the same way Jesus was raised from the dead, we will be raised from the dead. And he talks about how hard it would be to retroactively force all those Christian communities to change their view, even 10 years later, even 15 years later, how difficult it would be to get them to change their view on something like the afterlife, and how you just don't see that. The earliest Christian writings we have, and there's a ton of Christian writings from the first century that a lot of us aren't even familiar with. There's Clement of Rome, and there's Shepherd of Hermes, and there's Epistle of Diogenes, and there's the writings, early second century writings of like Ignatius of Antioch, etc. And they all, everywhere we see Christianity spread, and it spread pretty far throughout Europe and everything. All of those people all have that story, which if this was the Apostle Paul, even 20, 30 years later, trying to change the faith, it would be darn near impossible to go back and get people to change their views on what happened to Jesus, change their views on what will happen to us from a resurrection standpoint. And I thought it was an interesting observation that, it kind of pushes that claim back, even though, early 50s is pretty darn early for the first writing. It even goes back further, kind of like you were saying with that creed and just this idea that pretty much every Christian that we know held that view very, very early.
Yeah, he has some interesting points in this, but I don't think he fully addresses like the actual question. He just kind of like rants on about Matthew and different, talks about contradictions and talks about errors. Doesn't even name, like, I feel like he needs. Maybe you could tell us we're strawmanning him, but at the same time, he's not even really answering the question. He's just, oh, I don't really believe this, but you see, if I did, and he never
Which was his answer was kind of interesting when he said, "I don't believe it happened," or "I don't believe any of these stories." Because one of the other videos that you sent me, and I assume we're going to watch it later, but like one of the other videos, he says that he thinks that the resurrection story started from a hallucination that Mary Magdalene had, and which goes in direct contradiction to this. So I don't know if these videos are a different time and he changed his view or whatever, but it's kind of interesting that he has both those two different statements where like he says two different views of what he thinks happened with Jesus in the two different videos. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, we can continue through this one.
Cool.
What kind of thing they wouldn't report that no more than the Soviet Union would. They wouldn't even report when there was a nuclear accident in Chernobyl and took 3 days for the world to find out because they thought it would be embarrassing. Do you think the church would ever report such a thing? Now, I don't believe that part. Okay, but I'm just saying. Do you realize the amount of? Do you measure how much Baileys you have to drink to believe that? Okay. Now, if now I will do this with you because I want to cause as little friction as possible. Anyway, are you insane, Rabbi? I'm not. So I'm just going to do this. It's not that I believe this. Okay, I don't. But I'm not saying I do. Don't. I'm just saying I'm going to play what if. The most logical story. I'm not saying the most. I discussed this in volume 1, but there's a simple explanation. The truth is that nobody thought he rose from the dead. No one thought such a thing. That means that, let's say he was crucified. I know scholars say that this is axiomatic. I'm not going to argue that point. Okay, that there was a man named Jesus who was crucified. I just don't want to argue. We don't have any contemporary historians, but it is a consensus among New Testament scholars, Christian or otherwise, that Jesus was crucified. So I'm going to go with it. Okay, well, the obvious answer is that Jesus didn't appear to anybody, and there was no body. There was nothing to talk about. This is incidentally why 1 Corinthians 15. That's very early. That's much.
I'm very interested in into what he just said. Uh, because he said something about maybe he was crucified, but we have no contemporary historical accounts.
Yeah.
Uh, but before that, he said something about what if, or my solution is that nobody believed he rose from the dead, which is interesting given what we just talked about in the last section about
Yeah.
creeds dating before Paul, and just our Christian writings. So
Yeah, that statement really, like, it's hard to square that with the behavior of the early Christians, right? Like, if the idea that you have all these people that are like sacrificing their lives and, like, you know really confronting Rome, acting boldly, pretty much dedicating their lives to spreading this gospel. That's hard to square with the idea that they didn't at least believe it. You know what I mean? Like, so, like, I think I'm a believer. There's a lot of people that believe crazy stuff. Like, when Mormons show up at my door, I think Mormonism's absolutely wrong, but I believe that the people that are showing up at my door believe it, right? And I think, terrorists, like, for Islam or whatever, they might be crazy and they might believe something that's wrong about, like, dying for Muhammad or whatever. But I believe the people crashing the planes truly believe it. So, like, it's normal to, like, give your life to something that's might be wrong, but you believe. It's very strange motivations in my mind, and I'd be curious what he thinks their motivations could have possibly been to, like, know that it's false, like, know Jesus wasn't risen from the dead. They stole the body, they hid the body, they made the whole story up, they lied about all this stuff, and then they go out and dedicate their lives to spreading this gospel. They're willing to die for it. They're willing to, like, confront Caesar and confront, like, it just, I don't know what those motivations could possibly be. And maybe you have some thoughts there, but I can't think of what a motivation could be for making it up and then acting the way they act.
well, I know that there are theories out there. I have a few friends who they're not Christians, and their theory is it's called like the cognitive dissonance theory or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That these Christians made up the story that is recorded in the Gospels, and then because of mourning and because of not wanting to let go of this messianic figure that was Jesus and their teacher, and basically to people like the disciples, their brother pretty much, especially someone like James. And they, once Jesus died and was whatever happened to his body, I mean, we're not going to get into that right now. They then made up the story to spread it around to keep Jesus's message alive, and to basically relieve themselves of this mourning. Now that's a very simplified, uh, that's very simplified, and I hope one of them watches this and corrects me on it. That's a very simplified version, but uh, that's kind of the theory there, is that these Christians made it up because they didn't want to let go of the figure that is Jesus.
Yeah. Yep. And that's one of the theories that N.T. Wright talks about in depth in that Resurrection of the Son of God book. But his basic response to that is that no one, and I'm sure Tovia would actually agree with this, is that no one actually, in the first century Jewish world, no one expected a Messiah to raise from the dead, right? Like, it was not, that wasn't, nobody was like, oh, there's going to be a Messiah and then he's going to raise from the dead. A lot of Christians think that. A lot of people think that's what the Bible says or whatever, but no one was expecting it. And even when Jesus, like, hints at it in his teaching or talks about his teaching, you can tell the disciples think he's being metaphorical or whatever. Like, they don't, it's clear the disciples don't understand that that's actually what's going to happen, right? Like from every time he brings it up. And there's so many examples of this sort of thing happening where a guy would get a following, be a charismatic leader, get on the wrong side of the Roman Empire, get crucified, and get killed. And probably in 100% of those cases, his disciples or his followers would be like bummed out and sad and long for him. And they might, like, there's lots of examples of people thinking of like, his spirit was with them and maintaining his teachings. And like I said, anointing maybe his brother or his son or his another family member or whatever to take his mantle. But it would be a singular and incredibly unique thing to think that person physically rose from the dead. And one of the things N.T. Wright spends a lot of time talking about in that book, and that book's like 750 pages or something crazy like that, but he spends a ton of time explaining that in the first century, resurrection and like seeing a ghost or seeing kind of having a spiritual sense of someone being there were very, very different things in Jewish theology. Like, if I were to say, like, if you died and I was like, oh, the lone Spartan is still with us, like that, they had language for that. It was like the idea of a ghost or the idea of a spiritual presence of someone. They had language for that. And it was a very, very different thing than resurrected. So like, if I was like, hey, I've got this sense that lone Spartan is still with me, I'm going to say he's resurrected. They would say, well, I get that you have a sense that lone Spartan is with you, but why are you saying resurrected? Because resurrected means something. It means this physical rising from the dead. And that was very unique to Jewish theology. And you see in the New Testament some debates about that, where like the Sadducees did not believe in it, and the Pharisees did believe in it, and they're arguing about it. It would be very strange for them to do that. So it's like, I guess it's possible in theory, but it'd be a very weird thing. Like it'd be as weird for them to do that as for us to do that with, if somebody in our group like all of a sudden died and then we like pretended like he was physically with us still. Like it would be a weird thing. So
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think in like Jewish belief systems of that time, having like a vision or something like that of a dead person was just confirmation they had made it to what we would call heaven, I
Yeah.
think.
Yep.
And then things like that, like the belief that seeing Jesus in a vision would then inspire them to make up the story about them physically resurrecting doesn't really line up. I think one of my major issues with the dissonance theory, and it's not that I think it's a bad theory. I'm not a Christian, so I don't think the resurrection happened also, but I think one of the bigger issues is why the New Testament story of Jesus goes against, and even Rabbi Singer talks a lot about this in his videos, goes against so much of Jewish theology of the time that to make it up and then it to just explode like that doesn't make much sense. It's doesn't really follow the simplest theory, right? They believe that when the Messiah resurrected or when the Messiah came back, everyone would be resurrected. So to think that just this one dude who claimed to be the Messiah then resurrected physically doesn't make much sense to put into a story if you wanted other people to believe it and other Jewish communities to believe it. Just the story of Jesus, some of the teachings of Jesus, being accepting of Gentiles, people like that, doesn't make a ton of sense to make up in terms of when we're trying to appeal to Jewish audiences.
It's one of those stories that would be super weird and really, in my opinion, would only kind of take off if like there was credible witnesses to it. Like if there's credible people saying, "Hey, yeah, we saw this," you know.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps you can argue that Peter and James were pretty big, credible witnesses, but I'm not sure, especially in that time, women were not credible witnesses, which is it's
Yeah.
another apologetic maneuver to say, oh well, the stories have women as the witnesses, and while I really don't like that a ton in a lot of apologetic videos, especially like your pop apologetics. Oh, we know the tomb was empty because they have women in their story. I don't really like that. I think there is a scholarly, there's a scholarly, I guess, debate on it as giving some credibility to the story. Given if you were making up a story that you wanted to save the legacy of this guy, save the legacy of this Messiah, why
Yeah.
are you going to have the women be the first one to come to the tomb?
Yep. Yeah. Wright talks about that. And it's funny. Wright talks about how by the time Paul writes First Corinthians, Paul's discussion on the witnesses leaves out the women. Like if you read First Corinthians 15, talks about 500 people, talks about the apostles, talks about himself seeing the risen Jesus, doesn't mention the women. It is a kind of interesting observation that all four gospels mention the women first, when actually in Tovia, one of Tovia's other videos that I alluded to already, he actually undermines I think it was the one on the mental health. He undermines Mary Magdalene's witness because he thinks she was mentally unhealthy or whatever. But that's like exactly what the writers of the Gospels exposed themselves to. Is in the first century, it was like very not credible to have women there. And it is interesting that all four Gospels, and there's a lot of differences between the resurrection narratives in all four Gospels. That part being the same in all four is crazy, right? It's a strange thing for all four to note.
Yeah, I think Dale Allison mentioned something about that in his book about, out of the consistencies in the narratives, the tomb narratives, although, there's differences such as number of angels or stuff like that, the consistency in them are very realistic for that time. So, I mean, there's that to note. For me personally, like if I'm going to argue the tomb was a made up concept, I would go with something I hold to right now, that the gospel writers weren't these writers writing for Christian communities, but they were scholars that were very well versed in Jewish, Greek, and Roman literature of that time. So I think that's what I would go with towards that. They knew what they were writing. They knew how to write it to appeal to people, but also why they get certain Jewish theologies wrong when it comes to the narrative, such as why they would have Jesus resurrect just as one. If they were trying to appeal to Roman and Greek audiences, which had other gods, because they were polytheists, other gods resurrecting as one. So that was
I look forward to talking about that more because that N.T. Wright talks about that in incredible depth, and I hate to keep referencing N.T. Wright, but his book on this is very good from a scholarly standpoint. I mean, he's N.T. Wright, for anybody in your audience, he's a guy that is an Oxford scholar, taught at Oxford, taught at Cambridge. I think he's taught at St. Andrews. Just true scholar, writes 800-page books that are intended for a scholarly audience. Expert in the New Testament world. And one of the things that he makes the strong case for in New Testament of the people of God and in Jesus and the Victory of God is how absolutely accurate the Gospels are for the first century Jewish world in a way that they couldn't be written from an outsider. That everything down to like weird political debates that only were a big deal in the 30s AD are being brought up by the gospel writers as like a controversy that would not have been a controversy just 30 years later. Like just absolutely interesting, intricate arguments about politics around Herod's wife getting divorced and that kind of thing. Like very weird details about first century Jewish Jerusalem politics, making it just a little bit later. So like I'd be interested. We can obviously talk more on that, but like I think it's incorrect to say that the Jesus being resurrected first was to appeal to Gentiles, in that there is a incredible Jewishness to that as well. It's a weird combination of highly Jewish theology that doesn't match anything before it. So the way Wright describes it is like you buy a plant and the plant's a beautiful plant by itself, and then it spouts out a flower that you didn't know was going to flower. It matches the plant, and it's, in retrospect, it looks like it was supposed to be there. It's supposed to come out of it, but it was unexpected for the day. And he describes the resurrection in that same way, that it matches what everything in the Old Testament. The New Testament writers clearly saw that as something that came out of the Old Testament, and yet nobody was expecting it before it happened. So I find that compelling, and I understand there's a lot to that argument, and it's hard for me to make the argument in a short little video like this, but like that I found very interesting and persuasive.
Yeah. In his next video, we're gonna go over. I think it's only like, was it like 8 minutes or something?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
About how the New Testament writers concocted the resurrection. I think we can probably get a little bit more into that just because he brings up.
Yeah, that's cool.
But we can continue with this video. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
That's much earlier in the Gospels. 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't even know how to describe what was this resurrected Jesus. He was not the Jesus that was crucified that we would see in John showing the wounds in the hands and Peter eating fish. So that means you see that this is much later development. I'm not saying the most logical event that occurred. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying the easiest construction without getting into an argument to avoid problems is saying, let's just say this: Jesus was one of 200,000 Jews who were executed. Okay. What happens is that people are disappointed. Eventually, 3 years later, 5 years later, Mary Magdalene, who's mentioned 12 times in the Passion narrative, starts saying that Jesus appeared to me. You're going, how is that possible? We had a guy here in Indonesia. His name is Peter the Great. That's not his real name. Who people are saying appeared to him all over the place. Sai Baba in India. People see him appear. He has 30 million followers. He's appearing to everybody all over the place over pancakes in New Delhi. The point is that at some later stage, somebody said, probably a woman, like today, who says Mary met me? Generally, it's not men, it's women. Maybe that's why they're all women. I'm just saying. So what happened? I mean, the simplest answer, this is Occam's razor. The simplest thing is, eventually, the idea that Jesus rose from the dead somebody began to say it. Other people doubted it, weren't sure. And that's where you have the doubting stuff in the Gospels, pushing back at that, incidentally, which would make a lot of sense. But so therefore, the whole idea that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the dead, which Paul says he did not. Paul says, of course, it was a resurrection. If you read 1 Corinthians 15, he doesn't say it was a human body that rose. He says it was a spiritual body. What does that mean? 8,000 New Testament scholars argue what that means. But Paul is one thing for sure. He said,
this game, you're not ready for it.
saying it was not the physical body Jesus had when he was around. It's like a seed that dies in the ground and something completely different comes out. We're not even putting the bodies. We see, therefore, that the resurrection.
Can I just mention something real quick? What he's saying there is absolutely not good New Testament scholarship. Like Paul does talk about the spiritual body and the fleshly body, and a lot of people incorrectly think that means some kind of like a metaphorical resurrection versus a bodily physical resurrection. That is not what Paul is saying there. And actually, if you read all of First Corinthians, it is very clear that he's talking about a true physical resurrection. He mentions that over and over again. And actually, just the fact that he says some have said that the dead have already been raised, and he's making it clear, no, this is not true. There's going to be a physical resurrection. And he talks about the graves being like seeds. He says, we're planting seeds that will then be raised up, that Jesus is the first fruits of that. When he says the fleshly versus the spiritual, there it's more like he's talking about holy versus unholy, sinful versus non-sinful. He's not in any way talking about a metaphorical resurrection. Like I said, and like N.T. Wright goes to like 400 pages to describe, they didn't have a concept of a metaphorical resurrection. Like when you said, if you were to say, hey, I sense someone's presence or he's spiritually with me, you wouldn't say that was a spiritual resurrection. You would say that is a ghost or that is a spirit. And that is the sensing the presence of Jesus. You would never say that's a resurrection. Resurrection, by that very word, always meant a physical resurrection. And it's clear from 1 Corinthians 15, if you read the whole chapter, it's clear that's what Paul is saying. It makes no sense if it's a metaphorical spiritual resurrection, like in our modern day language. That's not what the Apostle Paul is talking about. So that's confusion there. I don't know if he hasn't read the whole chapter or if he is. I'm not sure why he's saying that, but it's clear that's not true from the passage.
Well, I think again, like you said, he's trying to kind of pull that. Paul meant non-physical resurrection, which is interesting. I think there's still a lot of debate in like Pauline studies over what Paul really meant, because like Paul, just like Jesus in some sense, is very, you get his point, but he's kind of vague about it. So I think there's still a lot of debate in that area over what he really meant. But I think there's a good case to be made that he definitely meant physical. It's interesting what he said here because, he's like, and then a few years later, this woman hallucinates and starts this movement, which is very weird for a number of reasons. Number one, like, what is a few years later? I mean, like, people are just going to be like, no, this guy's been dead for 5 years.
Yeah.
Two, why is a woman hallucinating? Like what happened there? Number two, if they hallucinated Jesus, then she's just going to take that as a sign of, oh, hey, he's in heaven, with their concept of heaven. Then,
right?
They're not going to take that as suddenly 5 years later, this woman has a vision, and then suddenly, she just starts off this movement of a physical resurrection in a physical tomb, visiting people physically. Like, I don't see how that really lines up to what we see.
And it also gets back to that whole point of like trying to put the genie back in the bottle when it came to what people believed about Jesus. The longer you go out, the harder it is to like change the narrative everywhere, because it spread pretty quickly. If you look at 1 Corinthians, for example, the Apostle Paul's already talking about Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire. So within those first 15 years after Jesus, the church grew like crazy. And so this idea that 5 years later, 10 years later, or whatever, they could then say, hey, by the way, he rose from the dead, and have it take hold everywhere that Christianity spread, is just very, very difficult to believe, right?
I think I could be wrong, and I could just be spreading false information, but I think we even have like tombstones that were in like what would be like Eastern China that had like "in Christ" on them or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
So
it spread very, very quickly. Yeah, India, China, there's missionaries went all over the place very early. So even like I said, by the time of Paul, he in mid 50s AD, he's already talking about the church throughout the empire.
yeah, so it would be really weird for a hallucinogenic woman to then dream this up and then suddenly just bang, it's across pretty much what was the known globe at that time.
Yep.
So it just seemed really weird. That seems like a very weird theory to propose, but I'm not him.
With this, and I am sure that this development that Jesus rose from the dead physically does, in the way Christians now believe it, doesn't happen until 60, 70. Yeah, once we get to Mark doesn't even have a real resurrection appearance because the last 12 verses are interpolated. And then by the year 70, 80, 90, then this begins to gel. Why does it gel? It gels because early Christians are going, what exactly resurrected? She asked me, why did they produce a body? They produced a body. They didn't even know anybody died or anybody rose. They didn't know anything. This is all a much later development. But the problem is that people who are either Christians or grew up in the Christian world think, and I mean this, even if they're knowledgeable, they kind of think like after Jesus died, he's walking around, and the whole New Testament sort of floated down from heaven. The whole Christian Bible is much, 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 much later, and this is a development over time, and therefore the question is pregnant with false presuppositions. There was no body because no one's asking for a body. This is all developed later. And if someone today, by the way, there's this guy, Simcha Jacoby, I don't say he's right or wrong, but there are guys who say we found the tomb of Jesus. I don't see any evangelical Christians running around going, really, I want to see it. None of them are interested. Why, if in fact this is a case that Christians would have been interested in seeing a body, how come no Christian is even interested in seeing what has been found in Talpiot? I'm not saying it's true, but why are they even curious?
Hey, just a real quick point on that last point there is, when I remember that story, it was like 10 years ago, 15 years ago or something. Some guy claimed that he found a what's called an ossuary, which is a box of bones that had the name Jesus on it, and did some kind of analysis saying that it must be the real Jesus. I remember that, and Christians absolutely were interested. They absolutely dove into it. It turned out to be complete garbage scholarship, and nobody, even secular atheist people, believe it. But people absolutely were interested. So what he just said there is false.
Yeah, it seems weird because what he's assuming is that our interest now would be their interest then.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's like, well, Christians now, they wouldn't be interested in it, which they would, but they wouldn't be interested in it. Therefore, these first century Palestinian Jews wouldn't be either. And that seems very weird, especially given there is 2,000 years between the two groups. And that's 2,000 years of human development. That's 2,000 years of belief changes. Back then they absolutely would have been interested in it.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think, I could be wrong, there were certain burial rituals in Judaism where like they wanted the body of the dead people to move, or some tradition like that. I forgot. They wanted the body to be moved, and so they probably would have gone looking for Jesus's body anyway.
So what they typically would do, and we could probably jump to the next video because I think one of the other two videos you sent me, I wanted to talk about this. But what they typically would do is, and in the case of the New Testament, you see this, is there's Joseph of Arimathea lent them his tomb, and that term "lent" is a weird term. But basically what they would do is they'd typically put the body inside a tomb, and there'd be like shelves inside the tomb. It'd be like a cave. They put the shelf in, the body on one of the shelves, and then they would let that body decay until it was bones. And then they'd sweep the bones into what was called an ossuary. They put the cap on the ossuary. They'd write the name on it, and they'd put the ossuary on a shelf somewhere. And so the bones box basically would be where they would keep the body after it had fully decayed. And then they would reuse the tomb. So the tomb got used by multiple people. A tomb was rarely a single use tomb. And so it's hard for us to understand that when we think of like burying a body. Usually we don't want to open that back up. But in the case of in this era at this region, they did that all the time. They were constantly opening those tombs back up.
Yeah. So now I know Mark Goodacre just released an article. I think it actually might have been yesterday that I read a little bit of, where basically argued that the tomb wasn't empty in the sense that we think of it. It wasn't totally empty as most Christians would think. When we think of an empty tomb, we think of there was, it was just Jesus's body. They walked in and Jesus's body wasn't there, and there was nothing else in the tomb. But I think he argued that like there would have been other bodies, especially in a tomb that Joseph of Arimathea would have owned.
No, that's almost certainly true. Is that was it? It would be rare to only use a tomb once, and even if it was Jesus, he was the first. They almost certainly would have planned to put more in later. Like it wouldn't have been. It wouldn't be like they bury one guy, they seal it shut, and never open it again. That just wasn't what they did.
Yeah, I know a lot of people then kind of jumped on that. And this is a theory that I think is also plausible, is that 3 days or whatever. There's two options there. Since the tomb wasn't empty, and since it was a higher ranking person's tomb, and they wanted, this is Jesus, even if he was a great influential teacher, he was still poor. He was still lower class. So, they wanted it out. So they either one, take him out, or two, stick him in some type of bone box or some type of box, then put away, and then Mary or whoever we decide walks up and sees that, oh, Jesus' body isn't there, even though Jesus' body is in a box, an ossuary box somewhere, or it's moved or something like that.
I hear what you're saying, and like it's interesting. That's actually, if you read the resurrection accounts, that's what it looks like. The women assume there. If you remember, they asked the angel, they're like, "What did they do with the body? Like, where did they move the body? Like, where's my Lord?" They're wondering, like, did they move it? Did they take it out? Like, where's the body? And so, I think that was probably like what they assumed. Like when the body wasn't, they didn't see the body. They're like, someone must have moved it. Like their first impulse was not, oh, he resurrected. It was, oh, they moved the body somewhere. Can we find it? Like, let's figure out where it is. And then of course they physically saw him, and that's when the whole narrative changed. But that was their initial response, was exactly what you said, was that they assumed someone moved it.
Well, I think this is just my own personal opinion, but I think that's why arguing for the empty tomb is actually a terrible apologetical approach. Like, you'll see a lot of Christians, whether it's on Twitter or YouTube or like that, oh, the tomb was empty, therefore the best explanation is Jesus rose from the dead. But not even the disciples or Mary believed that was even they didn't believe that was the best explanation at that time. They were like, oh, where did he move the box? That's why, for me, I know this gets a little bit off topic, why the empty tomb is just not good evidence of the resurrection, at least to me.
Yeah, I don't know that the empty tomb by itself is good evidence. I definitely believe you have to take a bunch of different points together, right? So like, and I think you have to say, okay, so the tomb being empty is one, or Jesus's body not being in the tomb. And maybe it wasn't empty, maybe there was other bodies in there or whatever, but his body not being in the tomb is an interesting thing. Multiple witnesses claiming they saw him is an interesting thing. There's him clearly being dead and then being seen again alive. So I think there's like a culmination of evidence, of which him not being there on Sunday morning was part of it. But yeah, I think the real argument is not that his body wasn't where it was supposed to be, because obviously that could mean a lot of stuff. But I think the real argument was his body wasn't where it was supposed to be, and they saw him raised from the dead, right? I think both of those have to go together.
Yeah, I mean, I also think you have to argue from a lot of things. You have to argue, well, the tomb was empty, and then the disciples believed that they had experiences, and then the church exponentially blew up, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
Paul believed he had an experience, and then
Yep.
Paul wrote about it with earlier creeds, and then the Gospels were written, and then you can kind of argue that they were eyewitnesses. Like, I think you have to
Yeah.
kind of build this entire case before you just say, that's why the minimal facts approach to me is a really bad approach to it, because you can easily, the tomb was empty. His is like, well, Jesus died by crucifixion. The tomb was empty, and then the disciples believed they had experiences. That's not enough to establish what you want it to.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that is like a culmination of a lot of stuff. Like, I had like a little debate with a guy with an atheist, and he said, "Well, the tomb could have been empty because aliens took them." And I'm like, "Well, that would be incredible coincidence if like Jesus said he was going to raise from the dead, and then aliens took him, right?" I feel like you kind of have to take all these things together of like Jesus said he was going to raise from the dead. The tomb was empty. They saw him risen, opponents like Paul saw him risen, those kind of things. And like you take all these facts together, the movement grew was incredibly fast at that moment. Like all those put together, I think make an incredibly strong case. But I agree. Any one of those factors is not like by itself. I mean, if like I died tomorrow and you showed up at the cemetery and there's a hole in the grave and my body was gone, that wouldn't be proof to anybody that I had risen from the dead, right? Like that would just, your response would probably be like the ladies, where it's like, oh, what happened to his body? Like somebody dug it up or whatever. So like it's you're right. It has to be the culmination of all the pieces together to make the case.
We can go ahead and move on to this next video.
Sounds good.
In the New Testament, it is replete with demon possessions and casting out of demons, and the description of Paul about principalities and powers of the air. And hence the New Testament revolves around the notion of spirit world and the devil and demons and casting out of demons. But you don't see that in the Tanakh. What seems to be the big difference here?
The difference is that in the ancient world, people were like today, many people suffered from mental illness. That's the truth. Just think of all the people you know of that suffer from schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, people who suffer from borderline personalities, people who suffer from just so many mental illnesses. And when you meet someone who suffers from mental illness, two things should happen. You should feel very sorry for that person, try to get that person help. And the second thing is you should thank God that your brain works. I mean it. And I think that every person listening to my voice right now knows exactly what I'm talking about. But in the ancient world, they didn't understand any of this. In the ancient world, people who suffered from psychosis in particular psychosis, and psychosis typically is displayed by people hearing voices that aren't there and seeing things that aren't there. And it goes on and on. The paranoia that seizes the mind of the schizophrenic as something that's. We're living in a time when these ailments, these very, very severe ailments, are treatable. We're very fortunate. Doesn't mean that they're not chronic, they're chronic. But there are treatments that are available so that people who suffer from all kinds of neuroses and psychoses can cope. Not everyone, but many can. Thank God we have all sorts of Haldol and lithium, but they didn't have this in the ancient world, nor did they understand these maladies as mental illness. They didn't understand that. To them, the mental illness that unfortunately so many people suffer from was considered a devil, a demon that had to be cast out using incantations. You're right. You see it all over the Christian Bible because they didn't understand this.
Hey, can you pause it real quick? One thing I just wanted to note real quick is this idea that this is just in the New Testament and not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Tanakh, not in what we would call the Old Testament, is absolutely false. Namely, throughout the life of King Saul, he clearly was struggling with some sort of heavy depression. And throughout that, they call the depression an evil spirit, which another name for an evil spirit is a demon. So, like, for example, in 1 Corinthians 16, it says, now the Lord of God departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And then later in 1 Samuel 16, it says, see, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. And, you know, throughout the life of King Saul, he struggles with these evil spirits. And it's simply not true that you don't see this in the Old Testament. It's not as common in the Old Testament, but it certainly is found in the Old Testament. So you can keep going, but I just wanted to make that clarification.
You have in Luke, we're told that Mary Magdalene, she had demons, not one, but many demons cast out of her by Jesus in Luke chapter 8. It's the only mention of this Mary outside of the Passion narrative. She's only mentioned 12 times, but only once she's mentioned outside of the Passion narratives. This actually looms huge for Christianity because I'm fairly certain, I can't prove it, but in fact, this person, this Mary, is probably the one who imagined seeing a resurrected Jesus. And
okay, can you pause it real quick?
She's so.
So he's getting back to kind of that weird theory he has about Mary Magdalene later on, like imagining it. I did want to say, I'm not sure what your thoughts are on the demonic possession in the New Testament and its relationship to mental disorders. I don't think, my personal reading of the New Testament is I don't think that they're exactly the same thing. I think that first of all, I believe that spirits are real, and I think that it is possible for a spirit to influence your behavior and affect your behavior. And I don't think there's anything in the New Testament that demands that we think, oh, they thought that schizophrenia was demon possession. And then the other thing I wanted to say on that is, I feel like demon possession may, I believe, well, first of all, before I keep talking, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with me there? Do you think that it is actually mistaking mental disorder for demon possession? Do you think it's not clear? Or what are your thoughts?
The demon and spiritual parts of the New Testament are very interesting to me because there's a lot going on surrounding them. Personally, my belief is Jesus was more of a apocalyptic prophet, so he believed that the kingdom of God was coming soon. He believed that, that everyone wants to repent. He believed that, he believed a lot of these things, and he preached these things. So I think there's a lot of background information that has to go into this before we, or we assume that she had schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia it's very possible. Um, they they took it as demon possession because of the symptoms of it. You see things, you hear voices, you do things because these voices tell you to do it. Um, so it's very, very possible they saw it that way. But in this particular case, I'm not sure it's because she was schizophrenic. It seems to me to have more of a symbolic um, approach to it. Seems to have more of a meaningful, Jesus cast these demons out of Mary um, type thing. It doesn't seem to me that they're depicting a mental illness, but they may be. Like it's very possible that they saw schizophrenia as demon possession.
Yeah. One of the things that I think a lot, and I'm not sure, do you believe in spirits at all, or you don't believe in spirits, or what are your thoughts on the spiritual world? Are you
I'm not like I'm weird, so I would consider myself like more of a deist. Like there's probably something out there, but I'm not really sure what it is. I'm not really sure about spirits or things like that. So I'm kind of like on the agnostic side of that type of stuff.
have you looked into like, do you know what ayahuasca is or DMT? Do you know what those are?
Uh, sorta.
So ayahuasca is like a psychedelic. It was used in Mesoamerica. It was like used by the Incas and other tribes, other kingdoms and tribes throughout South America and Central America. And it's a drink. The active ingredient is DMT, and the reason I know about it is like modern day people like Joe Rogan and Mike Cernovich and other people kind of advocate it. But it's a very interesting drug because, first of all, DMT is actually in our brains. And so we have like a little bit of DMT in our brains. But it also is a very interesting drug because when people take it, they almost universally, independent of culture, independent of personal beliefs, independence of whether they're Christian, atheist, etc. Almost everybody says that they see entities while they're on it. Like if you take enough of it, you see these entities. People describe them as elves. They describe them as like mind robots or whatever, but almost everybody sees them to the extent where when they give it to atheists, a majority of the atheists, after they come off it, stop being atheists. So like a majority of atheists say, I'm not atheist anymore. And when people come off it, they believe is unlike like if you see something, if you smoke pot or take LSD or whatever, you know it's like a dream and you come off it and you assume it's all wrong or not real. People come off DMT and they're like, no, that was real. That was, and some of these scientific studies, they say it was more real than real life. Like they'll say it was more real in real life. And I find it very interesting as a Christian. I don't advocate it at all because I think that you have to be really careful with spirits. Like spirits can be good or spirits can be bad. But the reason I bring this up is like, I think the fact that we have DMT in our brain and the fact that we can take a drug and see what I would argue might be spirits. Like, I don't think it's unbelievable to me that some sort of mental illness can open the door to maybe a different chemical like DMT or whatever, opening the door to seeing spirits. And I don't think you blame that person. I'm not saying that people that have schizophrenia always are seeing demons or whatever, but I'm saying that it is, you see from at least from DMT use, is that the divider between the spiritual world and our physical world may be taken down a little bit depending on your brain chemistry, right? And that's like, we like to separate the physical and the spiritual, but the Bible never does. Like getting back to the resurrection, the whole idea that we're physically resurrected as your spirit and your body go together. And I would argue like certain drugs can open the door to certain spirits. And I don't know why that wouldn't be true with some sort of mental illness also. So I know that's a long side and there's a lot to talk about there, but like, that's my personal view is like, I'm not in any way saying that people with mental illnesses have demons or whatever, but I am saying that I don't think it's an insane thing to say that some sort of mental illness could open the door to seeing some sort of spiritual world that may include bad spirits as well as good spirits.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my opinion, his theory could be on the way to be a decent theory, just because you can have things like, let's, for example, Mary is schizophrenic, Jesus dies. It is absolutely not impossible she saw, Jesus, or she saw this figure who she recognized as Jesus.
But
So
let me ask you this though. Let's say you're Peter or you're James, Jesus's brother, or you're the Apostle Paul, who's not even like doesn't even like Christianity, right? Like he starts off as a critic of Christianity. Why would you believe, of all the people to believe, why would you believe someone that clearly had a mental disorder, assuming she wasn't healed of her mental disorder? Like, how much do you think that, I mean, you and I know crazy people, right? Like we know people that have suffer. Like I'm close friends with someone that has a major bipolar problem where she actually hallucinates stuff. And if she was like telling me she saw someone raised from the dead, like my first impulse would not be, she's right, and I'm going to dedicate my life to this. Like my first impulse would be extreme skepticism, right?
yeah, I mean, my mom worked in crisis mental health, so I've had my fair share of people like that. But I think we have to, number one, make sure we're not placing our skepticism on them. Number two, I think it's assuming that someone like me or Rabbi would accept that the gospel writers didn't just throw in Peter's experience in there. And again, I don't really hold to this theory, but I think it could be on its way if you worked out stuff. I think you don't have to accept that these disciples like Peter genuinely saw Jesus, because we don't really have any written accounts of Peter unless you really argue Mark, and that's kind of that's a different ballpark right now. I think it would be pretty easy to then just deny that Peter or people like that really had an experience, and then later on when the Gospels got written, they just added those in because they needed effects, and also because they needed the disciples to confirm what Mary said. Otherwise, if they just had Mary say it, then they're going to be completely laughed at, type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it like, I find the whole thing to be extreme. I think the idea that this early church, like, I mean, we started off by saying how not credible women are. He started off talking. I mean, like, it's funny. He is kind of doing exactly what the early church should have feared when they said women were the first witnesses, right? He clearly is dismissing the experiences of the women, right? Like he's saying, oh, one of them was crazy. And, and it's worth noting that none of the gospel accounts have only Mary Magdalene show up, right? That's worth noting that Mary Magdalene, he's acting like she was the sole witness or whatever. All of them have a collection of people seeing Jesus. Like none of them just have her see. So his theory is like, it's a giant house of cards, like built on, oh, in one passage, it says she had a demon and therefore she had schizophrenia. Therefore she saw the risen Jesus, and nobody else did, but all the gospels say that everybody else did. And therefore 5 to 10 years later, she said she saw Jesus, and like somehow it got retrospectively put in the church. Like, I don't find it to be a persuasive argument at all. Like, I don't see how a church could grow, whether they thought she had schizophrenia or whether they thought she had a demon. I don't know how that it could be a giant growth movement within this small community of 10,000 people or whatever, that this is how it takes off and is a lady with a demon or a lady that's schizophrenic or whatever. I don't find that to be something, especially in the first world. You think that we're skeptical of a female, like he's saying as a female, if you meant earlier, he's like, oh, females often come up with this kind of stuff. And then he also is saying she's mentally not stable. Like, if you think that in our world we get this criticisms, back then, like, women could not testify in court. Like, women were not allowed, like the skepticism towards women. You're right. We shouldn't project our skepticism. We should project more skepticism, because they were not considered trustworthy witnesses, right? They were considered people that should not be trustworthy. So it just, for me, I think it stretches credulity to a ridiculous level to say not only did they believe a woman, they believed a woman that apparently had mental disorders. Like, it seems like I can't see how that movement would take off within Israel.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't really hold to it, but I think you would have to work out stuff. But I think it could be there if you were able to kind of combat some of that. But we'll continue with this so that we can get through this.
Yeah, sounds good.
Prominent in the resurrection accounts. She's actually front and center in the resurrection accounts. I mean, she is the person. We have all sorts of Marys in the Christian Bible, but Mary Magdalene, she is the only one that's at front and center in every passion narrative, because the passion narratives are very famous, particularly the resurrection accounts are very famous for having different women come to the tomb early Sunday morning. But what they all have in common is that Mary is there. And in John, she's the only one there. There's a reason for it. Why is she so noticeably absent everywhere else? This occurred to me when I was Rabbi of Indonesia. In March of 2016, a very famous preacher. He was known as Peter the Great. I don't know if you know who he was. He was huge. He was a mega preacher. He'd fill stadiums of 40, 50,000 people. Huge. In fact, one of his assistant preachers repented and is a member of my congregation.
Hey, real quick, I hate to interrupt, but it's worth noting that in John, it clearly was not just Mary Magdalene. He said she was the only one there. But if you look at John chapter 20, it says on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. So it only names her, but it says in verse 2, so she came running to Simon Peter and said, they have taken our Lord and we don't know where they put him. So it's clear that it wasn't just her. From that story. So anyway, you can keep going, but I think it's inaccurate to say John said she was the only one.
Enormous. He was a Christian, of course, a Pentecostal, and he was telling his followers that he's going to lead them to the promised land. Only one thing happened. In 2016, he dropped dead suddenly. He was that old. He was in his late 40s. I don't know, what a heart attack, brain, whatever it was, he dropped dead like that. He was gone. If I tell you, it shook up the Indonesian world. Was just pow, and everyone. What do you mean? And people gave away their money. I mean, they have preachers that come with empty suitcases to Indonesia, Malaysia, and leave with full suitcases packed with cash. Same thing in India. This guy was big money, huge. He was huge. It was big. Many of his members who left Christianity, they knew exactly what was going on. They saw the point is that after he died, suddenly it created a problem among his followers. I mean, I don't know how many followers he had, but he packed stadiums. He was huge. He was like in America to have a Benny Hinn. He was like that. So it was women that started proclaiming that he appeared to them, like just a few days after he died. But when that went off, I got it. I know exactly what happened there. So I'm taking your question. I'm amping up your question. The Torah was written by Moses, who was inspired by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who knew very well what mental illness was. People were held accountable for sadness, for sure. Saul was sad, and that was not a good thing for him. But mental illness, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew, the Almighty knows what mental illness is, and he knows it's not a demon. The writers of the Christian Bible, however, were the result of the Greco-Roman world and far beyond. This
Yeah, I think the rest of that he just kind of talks about how Moses viewed that. But yeah, it was interesting, but I don't think he really answered the question. Like I think he kind of told stories. He kind of made parallels, but I didn't really notice him like making like the question was who concocted Jesus' resurrection, and he's just like, oh, there was this hallucinogenic woman named Mary Magdalene, and that was about it. Like I'm not 100% sure if she really if he really answered that question very well.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely, you can tell that that's something he thinks, and it's interesting. He keeps bringing up that they're women, and that happened in Indonesia or whatever. But which again would have been a critique in the first century as well. But I find it. It's a very, like you said, very undeveloped case. It's one of those things where I think you would need a lot more to it to be persuasive, and he definitely did not explain why. He didn't give me any sense of it being persuasive. So,
yeah. Do we want to go over this last video, or we want to end it here?
Totally your call. I'm happy to go through it. I got a little time, but if I don't know what your time's looking like, but I'm good running through it real quick, unless you got to go, and that's cool with me too. So whatever you want to do.
Nah, I'm free for a good while tonight, so we can go through it if you want. I believe, if I remember correctly, this is probably the better video of the three we've watched. I think this one's he does a little bit better, but I could be wrong.
All right, sounds good.
Oh. Here we go.
Okay. All right, Rabbi. We get this call. Let's take this.
Hi, William. I have a question for the rabbi. Why would two Marys go to the tomb of Jesus with spices after the Sabbath? Was this custom that women could touch the dead body, since this would make them unclean? Thank you.
All right, here we go. Rabbi, take it away.
That is such an important question. Why did the women go to the tomb to bring spices to anoint the body on Sunday morning? As it turns out, this is a question that no one asked. I've never heard it. It always seems to me to be the elephant in the room, because it demonstrates that the story of the empty tomb never happened. They're going, what? And I need to explain it. We are told in the Gospels, not all the Gospels, we're told, let's just take Mark as an example. The last verse of Mark 15, the first verse of Mark 16, that after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, Salome, They brought spices to anoint Jesus' body. That was the reason why they went to the tomb Sunday morning. In Luke, we find a very similar story at the end of Luke chapter 23, verse 56. They went home to prepare the spices and perfumes, and then the women rested on the Sabbath in obedience because they kept the law of the Sabbath. You don't prepare spices during Shabbos. And very importantly, on the first day of the week, that means now we're going to Luke 24, verse 1. What do? The women took the spices they prepared and they went to the tomb. So we have these stories where the body of the crucified Jesus is buried before the Shabbos, and women come to the tomb Sunday morning because we forgot to anoint with the spices. So we have to put the spices on the dead corpse. Listen very carefully. First of all, if you're a Christian and you're easily offended, you should turn off the show and watch something else. I don't mean to offend, but this is a point that everyone overlooks. This story never happened. It's complete nonsense. And ask yourself this question. Did anyone that you know of in your life, in history, ever go to a tomb 3 days later because some anointment had to be placed on a now rotting corpse? It never happens. Let me provide the background because the idea of having spices.
Hey, pause it just for a real quick second. Let me say something. It's interesting. He appealed to our experience. Like, did anyone you know in your life ever go to a tomb and put spices on something once it's already in the tomb? There is an assumption there of a grave that you shut and you never open again. And that is an assumption that makes sense in the 21st century in the United States or whatever. That's, as we talked about earlier, that's not an assumption for a tomb in the first century Jewish world, that there was, those tombs were regularly being opened back up for funerals, and it's not correct that you would never go back to the tomb once it had already been closed. So you can keep going, but you got to be careful about appealing to our modern day experience in when the first century world was very, very different on stuff like this.
Who passed away is all over Jewish tradition, and it's important to explain. The moment the person dies, the body immediately is decomposing, immediately. And as you can figure out, the body that is decomposing, it won't take very long for the body to give off an unpleasant odor, which is considered a bizoyan hames. It's considered a disgrace to the dead person. Do you understand this? It means imagine you're in Yerushalayim. It could be a hot day, it could be 90 degrees, and the body is now giving off an odor that is unpleasant. The point is the body is decomposing. So they had techniques, and this is described in our literature, that when washing the body, they would sometimes add spices to that washing process. It's called a tahira. They would.
Hey, can you pause it real quick? I just want to say something. So he's using Hebrew language, right? And he's talking about our literature. And I know for me, before I started studying this stuff, I assumed that like Jewish today had some sort of connection with Jewish first century, right? And so I hear him talking about our literature and using Hebrew language, and like you assume like somehow this lineage has gone on since the first century. I want to say that the modern day, the literature, for example, he's talking about, I don't know exactly what passage he's talking about, but a good chunk of Jewish literature was written after the time of Christ, right? So like the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Siddur, the Jewish Book of Prayer, the Talmud, the Jewish law code, all those were written centuries after these events took place. And Judaism as a whole changed radically after the fall of the temple in 70 AD, to the point where it's hard to even say it's the same religion. And so he's talking like, hey, I know how this goes. And I think it's incredibly important to say, like, him talking about first century Judaism is similar to me, like talking about third century Ethiopian Christianity, right? Like there might be some overlap there, and there might be some elements that are the same, but there's also like a lot of differences that certain things may mean exact opposite things. So that's not a specific critique of what he's saying, but it is a warning. Like when he talks about our literature, I'd want to say, are you talking about specifically the Old Testament? Or are you talking about, for example, the Catholics actually read the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books that were very popular in the first century, like the apostles are quoting them and stuff. And modern day Jews don't read that. So like in some ways, like Christians know first century Judaism better than a lot of modern day Jews do, because modern day Jewish people no longer read the Deuterocanonical books or the apocryphal books. So anyway, that's a long way of saying like you have to be really careful when he's talking like this, because he might not know what even like a regular New Testament scholar would know when it comes to what first century customs were like.
Well, it's interesting because I could be dead wrong here, but the strain of Orthodox Judaism he follows would be the Pharisees, would be a modern day, what would be the Pharisees in modern day, but his strain didn't come into fruition until after Christianity started. So their traditions don't even date back to the time of Jesus, meaning their traditions of, well, our literature says, but their literature doesn't go back as far as what we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's definitely true. Is that Judaism changed dramatically when the temple fell. It pre-temple destruction. So the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Pre-temple Judaism, pre-destruction Judaism, pre-temple destruction Judaism was highly based on the temple. So all their rituals, you see actually the early Christians, if you read the New Testament, they go to the temple on Saturday. They're, preaching from the gates of the temple. Their people are bringing sacrifices to the temple for, Jesus goes to the temple to cast out the money changers, et cetera, et cetera. All their whole religion was built around the temple. Once the temple got destroyed, Judaism kind of had to reinvent itself, and it reinvented itself in the rabbi tradition. And that's where you get the Mishnah in like 200 AD, and you get the other Jewish documents I was just talking about there as the centuries unfold. And those are all like developments on Judaism. So yeah, you're right. It's very different. And it is just, if a lot of times we think, oh, they were Jews in the first century and they're Jews now, it's kind of the same thing. And that's not true at all.
Well, it's very interesting because he does kind of do this a lot in his stuff, where he says, well, our understanding and our traditions say this and this and this. And then, but what we don't realize is that his traditions didn't come around until after Christianity. So,
and in most cases, centuries after, many centuries after.
Their understanding of the Old Testament, which he kind of appeals to a lot, didn't come until after. Like, we have to keep in mind that the Christians are writing off the first century understanding of Judaism, and he's going off centuries later. So the interpretation of the Old Testament, the understanding of the Old Testament, a lot of that stuff, it would be way different than his interpretation and his understanding.
Exactly. Yeah. And I would say almost everyone agrees, like the Gospel of Mark, almost everyone agrees was written by the mid 60s AD, right? So it's very early document, written in the first century Judaism, actually before the temple was destroyed. And almost everybody agrees it was written by somebody in the Jewish community. So if you want to like say who's the bigger expert on first century Judaism, the author of Mark or Rabbi Singer, and I think like there's almost no question. It's got to be, you have to take whatever Mark thinks is an appropriate set of behaviors for the people. Like, I think you have to put a lot more weight on that unless if Rabbi Singer was like, hey, here's a bunch of other first century Jewish documents, they didn't do this, that kind of thing, that would be a good argument. But just him kind of going off of like our literature, or like this is what Jews do, like I would say Mark is clearly talking about what Jews do in the first century, and I would take that as much more weight than anything from a couple centuries later. I don't know if you're talking, but I think I don't hear you. Are you still there?
Hold on.
Okay, no problem.
Let's see. There we go. Sorry, my mic's all weird.
Oh, no problem.
Does that sound better?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep, that's good.
Let's see. All right. Let's do this.
Sounds good.
Watch. I mean, this is definitely one of his better videos out of today. I think.
Yeah.
Definitely makes. But let's continue with.
Sounds good.
This.
In the shroud or around the shroud, there was a specific combination of spices that were so strong that would completely mask the smell of the decaying body. The point is that until you get inside the tomb, it could be hours and hours. So therefore, in short, the spices are added so that during the funeral procession, so that during the burial procession, no one smells the odor of the decaying body. That's the whole point of it. Once the body is buried, and I think you know where this is all going, nobody digs up a dead body, or in this case, if it's buried in a mausoleum or buried in a cave, no one uncovers the cave 3 days later to put spices inside. This is all complete nonsense. No one ever does because there's no reasons to do it. The whole point of adding spices, it's not like you have to have spices. If there's no spices with the body, then the body doesn't go to heaven. Has nothing to do with this. No mystery to all this. Therefore, the story that we find in the very first verse of Mark chapter 16, in Luke in chapter 24, verse 1, that never happened. That's all nonsense. There was no reason to go to a tomb after someone's been in it for 3 days. What are you trying to do? You're trying to make sure who can't smell the body. So how the heck did this ever wind up in a couple of books of the Gospels? The reason is they needed a plot device. They needed a plot device in order to explain how someone would come up with an empty tomb. There was no empty tomb, but what happened is they needed an empty tomb story because they need to say that Jesus rose from the dead. This is very important to the book of Mark in particular. Why? Because Mark ends 8 verses later. Mark ends in chapter 16, verse 8. Forget about what the other 12 verses that you see at the end of the Christian Bibles you have. Those last verses from verse 9 of chapter 16 all the way through verse 20, those were a later addition. It ends with the women were afraid and said nothing to anyone. That is the plot device. The plot device is, how do we get back the women to the tomb so we can have an empty tomb story? Think for a moment. Why would anybody...
Hey, I hate to interrupt, but can I say one thing on that real quick? It's an interesting theory that N2 Wright said that I thought might be relevant to his discussion is, so the book of Mark actually does start very abruptly and it also ends very abruptly like that. And then, at the end of Mark, there are those verses that most scholars think were added on the end after kind of that abrupt discussion of like, hey, the women saw it and said nothing. And then there's a bunch of verses added to the end. And what N.T. Wright argues, and I think it's a very interesting argument, and I found it persuasive, is that in the early days of the church, they used scrolls. And what often happens with scrolls, like if you roll up a piece of paper, what often happens is the ends of it get frayed, right? So you roll it up and one end is kind of sticking out and it gets frayed. And then you might roll it the other way and the other end sticks out and it gets frayed. And what N.T. Wright argues is that it's likely that the Gospel of Mark, one of the early copies, got frayed on both the beginning and the end. And that's why it starts so abruptly and ends so abruptly. But it doesn't mean that that's everything that was written. It's not like the actual original writing of Mark stopped there, that it most likely had some additional description of stuff that went on, possibly repeated in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, who both use Mark as a source. So it's very possible one of those are more like it. Actually, if you read the Gospel of Mark, you read what someone added on the end there to what we think is the original. It reads a lot like the Gospel of Matthew. So it may be that some early Christian scholar remembered the actual passage to some degree or another and wrote it in as best he could remember it. And it does in many ways match up with the Gospel of Matthew. So it's just an interesting little piece of color there that I don't think it's accurate to say that, hey, it ended there with this kind of mysterious quick end, and therefore that's all that the earliest traditions of Christianity had. Like we said, from 1 Corinthians 15, that's clearly not everything that was being taught at the time that Mark was written. If Mark was written in 65, 1 Corinthians 15 was written in 55, let's say, so 10 years earlier. It's clear there was more to the story in the Gospel of Mark. It just got frayed because of the way that they carried manuscripts back then.
Yeah, so I was actually discussing this the other day with another friend of mine. I think there's two separate things here. Number one, it's possible, and I know that it seems weird, and I know it goes against like most of the scholarly consensus. But another possible solution to why it ends and starts so abruptly is, and this is kind of getting into things, but basically, you would hold to Mathenian priority, and Matthew was written first, and then what Mark did was he abridged Matthew with Luke and created a bridge between the two, because Luke is a very Greek Roman style appealment, while Matthew was written for more Jewish audiences. So it's possible that what Mark did was he wrote the abridgment and tried to harmonize the two, and tried to make it into more of a cohesive and more collective writing of both the Jewish theology that Matthew kind of portrays, and then more of the Greek Roman theology Luke portrays, and and kind of abridge those two, and that's kind of one possible solution I was talking over with somebody.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then another one is I think, and I could be wrong, I think I read a paper that there's actually scholarship moving more towards that the ending of Mark, there was an actual ending to Mark, but it was either lost or it was passed down through like oral traditions and then added on later. So the edition we have now is actually like the oral tradition of the ending of Mark, and then finally a scribe got a hold of it and added that ending or that tradition down. So there's kind of two possible ways you could go about that.
Yeah, and the second one is probably similar to what I think N.T. Wright would argue. So, and I think that's the same. I guess both of us are saying something similar, though, is that it is not likely that what he's saying, which is like the earliest traditions didn't have a real resurrection story. I don't think that's actually true.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially if we date Paul's creed to when we do, it would seem very weird for Mark to then trail off and not add that in. And even if he didn't add that in, there was obviously still a tradition before Mark was written that there were appearances. Yeah. So I don't really accept that Mark was just it, and that Paul is wrong and Paul is misquoting a creed, and that there was no appearance tradition before that. I think it's likely that just Mark ended somehow, or Mark was an abridgment between the synoptics or something like that. I don't really agree that it just abruptly ended.
Totally agree. Yeah. All
right, let's continue.
Or it's in the tomb. It's been in there 3 days. It's decaying much, much further. but we have to put spices on it, even though no one's coming near it. Why would you want to mask the smell of a decaying body that is already in its place of burial? Why? So what? The cockroaches don't smell it? What? It doesn't make sense. It's completely ludicrous. And that's the reason why John, as he does often, is he corrects errors in the Synoptic Gospels. And John introduces us to a character that was unknown in all the Synoptic Gospels, unknown in the letters of Paul, and that's Nicodemus. Nicodemus is important for Jesus' conversation, chapter 3, not going there now. He changes it to have Nicodemus take care of everything, the spices and so on, before the burial. Now, I don't want to waste time talking about there's a contradiction, because why would the women have to add spices after Nicodemus did it already? What happens is the author of John is simply correcting this. So the story was invented in order to have an empty tomb story, because then you have a motive for why the women go back. And you see that, in fact, in John chapter 19, at the end of 19, you have our Nicodemus character, an unto then unknown personality who takes care of the spices and does all these things and makes sure that Jesus is buried properly. The empty tomb, my friends, never happened. Anyways, thank you for your question.
Hey, so I guess there's a lot to say there. My what I wish that he would talk about, and he almost never does, is I wish he would talk about the first century world and first century scholarship, because it's clear that he makes some bold statements like there's no reason they could possibly ever go back. They're going back to spice it for the cockroaches, he says. And I feel like there's a very obvious reason they might go back. And we talked about it all the time already. Like we've talked about it several times in this conversation, is that this was not a single use tomb. So like, and it's interesting. I looked up just out of curiosity in N.T. Wright's commentary on this passage, and he just states, as a matter of fact, that this was not a single-use tomb. They did not belong to the disciples, and so they just clearly were going back because maybe the next day or a couple days later there would be people there, and they didn't want Jesus's body stinking. Now, it is an interesting thing that Nicodemus had already spiced the body, according to John, and then they go back and they do it. Now is that a conflict? Are they contradicting the passages? I don't think it necessarily needs to be a conflict. I think it's possible that, if you remember the series of events here, we have very shocked event happening, right? Just a few days earlier, Jesus is like preaching in the square and like has a big following. They're doing the Palm Sunday where he rides into town on a donkey. Like everything goes from very, very good to very bad very quickly, right? Like there's big changes. So if you imagine emotionally, like one of your friends or someone that you love very much, a family member, goes from being this popular person to all of a sudden being killed in the most horrific possible way, and then being thrown into a tomb very quickly that same day, right? Like he was on the cross Friday, and by Friday night, he's in the grave. There's a lot of possible things that could happen, right? One is when Sunday came, they wanted to go back and see the body. Like they just wanted to spend time. Like most people, I've been in funerals, and there's like usually a time when you sit by the body and you talk to the body and you say goodbye to the body. Like that's a very normal thing to do. And I don't know if that was normal in the first century or whatever, but that's just one idea that comes to my head. Another might be they were confused on whether like maybe they didn't know Nicodemus had spiced the body. Like maybe they hadn't all talked to each other. They kind of went into hiding. Everybody scattered. It's a horrific, crucifixions were so bad. Like people didn't want to talk about it. People didn't speak about it in polite conversation. It was just a horrific way to die. And so it's possible they were all scattered. They didn't know. Nobody, maybe the women thought it got missed. And maybe Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea took care of it, and they didn't realize they took care of it, and they just were going to take care of it. Who knows why they did it? Maybe they were acting irrationally. Like people, sometimes when someone they love dies, I had my cousin died of a drug overdose, and her mother went crazy to try and see the body. Like it was the saddest possible thing, but like there was like this desperation that she had to see it and go with it. And like people do irrational things when someone they love dies. And so maybe these women just were like, hey, let's go back. We didn't get a good chance to see the body on the night he died. The smoke has cleared a little bit here. Let's go back and see the body. We'll put some spices on it. We'll spend some time with it. You know, maybe that's why they brought the spices, is maybe they knew it would be decomposed and they wanted to spend a little time with it. So they were going to put spices on it so they could sit there with it maybe and like whatever. Like, but his idea that there's no possible reason they could go back to the tomb. Well, it wasn't a single-use tomb, so there's a lot of reasons. Maybe somebody else was going to use it. Or maybe they just were acting irrational. People act irrationally. And the idea that it was a conflict with Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, I don't think that's a conflict either. Like I said, they could do it twice. They could think he didn't do a good enough job. They could not know he did it. Whatever. There could be a ton of reasons why they might go back with spices for that reason. So,
well, I know that there's actually I don't know the scholar. I'm not even sure if they're a scholar, but I know there was someone who wrote on their solution to this was that since it was not a single-use tomb, and since Jesus being a poor Palestinian Jew in a upper-class citizen's tomb, the women were going to spice the body because they were going to move the body out to a different grave, because this tomb specifically wasn't. It was. I don't know if they argued that it was like disgraceful to have someone, but it wasn't like considered a high honor to have a poor person in your tomb. Mm-hmm. So their solution was that the women were actually going to spice the body again to move the body to a different grave, just like Nicodemus did it to move it into the tomb. Sure. Yeah. So I know there's that, and I mean there's multiple ways you can say that they had to go back to spice it. I mean, I don't really see it as a contradiction. It's just kind of one of those that I don't see why they didn't have to go back. Like sure, you can say, well, there's no reason for them to go back, but why couldn't they? Right. I mean, I don't believe there was any custom of you cannot spice the body twice or whatever. So
yeah, that would have been a more interesting conversation from him. Like, and I feel that way on all these videos. It would be interesting to know the first century traditions, right? And like, what were the rules about the body? Like, could you go back? Could you not go back? Could you, like, and he didn't really get into any of that. He's just like, well, we wouldn't do that. Like, once you put the body in the grave, you leave it there, which obviously he wasn't thinking about the fact that it wasn't a single-use tomb. And so like, I really would love to know the more scholarship on that from the first century. And I know I've quoted N.T. Wright a lot. I do trust N.T. Wright's scholarship. I mean, he say what you want about him. He is a very well-respected scholar of first century Judaism. So like, N.T. Wright does not appear to have any kind of problems with this, and he's pretty open when he does have problems with things. And I personally doubt that this is any kind of issue when it comes to like first century Judaism, and this being a problem. And I also think like we kind of had talked about, like, if Mark is a first century Jew and this was not a normal thing to do, it seems like Mark would have mentioned it, right? Like he would have said, actually, they went back even though it wasn't normal because of blah, blah, blah. He would have given a reason for it because he would have known the tradition better than anybody. And he appears to just state it like it's just what happened,
Yeah, I mean, there's also the fact, like, he talked about earlier about like, oh, well, you if someone found the body, you wouldn't put it in the New Testament, which is true. But it also, like, I think he kind of set a double standard. Now, I know there's two different videos there, so we can't really say that too much. But, he kind of says, well, they wouldn't put that in if it happened. But in this instance, it seems weird that they would put something like that in, even knowing that, like, it was wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Like, why would they put in something knowingly going against tradition into
Yeah.
this book. I don't know. It seems a little bit weird, but nonetheless, I don't really see it as that big of an issue. Even as someone who's not a Christian, I don't really sit there and go, this is the best argument against the resurrection.
Yeah.
Like I don't really see that as very good. But I would like to see him, like, if he knows stuff about First Temple or first century
Second Temple, yeah,
Yeah.
first century, yeah, yep.
Judaism, to actually talk about it. But it seems a lot of the time when he's talking about this, he's kind of just like, well, I and my rabbi compatriots would not be doing that. And it's kind of like, well, sure, but your traditions, your works came after this.
Right.
So
Right.
we can't
Yeah.
really say, it would be like, there was weird, it would be like, they used to hang bells in caskets,
Yeah.
if they accidentally buried someone alive. But it'd be like, someone comes up with a story, they believe it, and I'm like, well, see, that doesn't work, because now we wouldn't put bells in the casket.
Right. Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yep.
I don't think it really works when you're talking about two different time zones with different traditions and different ways of doing things. So
Yeah, it did. Even like minor differences in time, like you think about if you and I had to like write about, say, Christianity, even in the United States 150 years ago, we would have to do a ton of research just to write about something 150 years ago, because a lot of the traditions have changed, the mode of behavior, the type of preaching, that kind of stuff. It'd be hard for us to do that. To imagine going back 2,000 years and trying to get it just accurately based on our current experience with Christianity, I think it would be really, really difficult and almost nonsensical. It would be like completely different traditions. So yeah, I think that's a big part of confusion, and a lot of what he's saying is like he just assumes based on his modern Jewish tradition that somehow it matches first century Jewish tradition.
Rabbi Singer is right. The New Testament is propaganda. I don't know what it would be propaganda for. Like, I'm not sure. Some have argued, I know, it was political propaganda for like the Roman Empire. I know scholars like Joseph Atwill has argued that. I know there have been scholars who argue that it's like pagan propaganda, that like the New Testament depicts pagan conceptions of Jesus. So it was actually like taking Jewish tradition and turning it pagan. But I'm not really sure, like, otherwise those fringe views, like what it would be propaganda for.
Yeah, it definitely is not very good Roman propaganda in that repeatedly it undermines much of what Caesar claimed about himself. And actually, one of the interesting things is like Jesus uses a bunch of language that Caesar used about himself. Jesus uses about himself. That's an interesting thing. Even like words like the gospel, words like the Son of God, all those things were typically applied to Caesar. So applying those to Jesus were like, it was almost, Jesus in many ways was almost like confronting Caesar in the language that he used. We don't pick up on it because we don't remember all that language, but it, from New Testament scholars I've read, is actually he's kind of jabbing Caesar a lot in his language, and so it definitely would not be very good pro Caesar or pro Roman language. And it, pagan versions of Christianity did pop up, and they popped up, in the 2nd century. And you see them in gospel, like the Gospel of Thomas and some of the Gnostic Gospels, where it clearly is integrating like pagan philosophy, like Platonic philosophy, and Christianity. But the 4 Gospels that made the Bible, not to mention like the writings of Paul, are very, very Jewish in their conception. And I saw on your bookshelf, Lone Spartan, that you had Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. He goes into a lot of details of like how a lot of the names that are listed in the 1st century or in the Gospels are like very unique to that region at that time and would not have been able to be created even 50 years later or 100 years later, from a different region, like just to do the research on what names were common in first century Jerusalem would have been extremely difficult for someone to recreate. So like, I feel like it could not be pagan propaganda. And I think it's, yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sure what kind of propaganda it could be. Like,
I mean, I guess you could argue like some type of theological propaganda against like Jewish conceptions, but I'm not even sure that would work. I don't know like what you would say it's propaganda for.
And I think it's worth, like, my personal opinion is like it's worth saying that, like Rabbi Singer mentioned, like, hey, they wrote it so that you might believe. I think it is worth noting, like, it is intended to like tell people about Christianity, right? It is intended to be there's no sense in which it's intended to be like this neutral document of like you might read in Josephus or somebody where it's like, hey, I'm not involved in this, but this is what happened. You know, like, I don't think that's what it's intended. It's clear that everybody writing in the New Testament believes what they're saying and like want to convince other people to believe it. But that doesn't mean they believe it's false, right? It doesn't mean they to the contrary, I would say they believe it's true. Otherwise they wouldn't be trying to convince everybody. So like, there is a sense in which it is, I don't know if you'd call that propaganda, but it is intended to convince. It is intended to draw other people into this movement. But I don't think it's propaganda in the sense that it is run by someone powerful trying to convince people to change their behavior or whatever. I think it's clearly written by a collection of Jewish people that believe what they're saying, you know?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I mean, you can obviously see in Gospels like Luke where it would appeal more to Greek or Roman audiences, but in more Jewish writings like Paul, Mark, Matthew, even a little bit of John, although John's more like apocalyptic Jewish type writing, or apocalyptic Greek / Jewish writing, but especially like Mark, Matthew, and Paul, being that they have a lot of Jewish theology in them, it would seem weird that, you know, that the Roman Empire would endorse that until they had to, or until you know, something happened. Also, you know, Christians were already causing them problems, you know, in the first and beginning of second century. It would seem weird to promote this stuff knowing that it's just going to basically ruin your empire. So it would seem very weird for the Roman Empire to have this as their propaganda. Like, and if they did, it would be very bad, and they really need to step up their game when it came to their propaganda, because I don't see how that would work. And
the interesting thing is we do have Roman writings that mention Christianity in the same time frame, and it's all negative. It's not like, hey, let's use this religion to help us. You know, it's all this idiot. You know, they're complaining about this Jewish sect that's causing them problems or whatever. But there's no sense in any of the Roman writings that they're endorsing it or they're going to use it to accomplish some kind of goal.
Yeah, like Paul. I know there are books out there where basically argue like Paul is probably just as Jewish as Matthew or Mark is. And it would seem very weird to say that, like, you know, the Romans would use this, especially when even Jews themselves, not Christianity, not like the sect of Jewish people that was Christianity at that time, just Judaism separated from that caused them a lot of problems. And then to promote something that then originated with this group just seemed it would seem very weird. So I don't see what it would be, what propaganda it would be promoting. I don't know, but I
agree.
think we've gotten through all the videos. I think we've answered the question that was in the chat. I think that's it.
All right, man. Well, hey, that was really fun talking about that. I really enjoyed it, and interesting conversation. So, appreciate getting together again. That was